Who's excited to talk about sex, or sex work more specifically? That's what we're going to be talking about today, which I'm sure hardly anybody is eager to hear about. And that's partly why I chose it. It's embarrassing and uncomfortable, and a conversation that most people would rather not have, but one that I feel is necessary. I know because I myself have some experience with sex work, which is more than just prostitution. It's pole dancers, webcam performers, phone sex operators. It's a lot of things. But for brevity, I'm going to be focusing on prostitution. I'm going to convince you why we need a change from our current system of criminalization, and why decriminalization and not legalization is the best solution. So if there's no real reason for sex work to be illegal, why is it? How did we get here? Well, laws regarding the regulation of sex work and prostitution are all done on a state-by-state basis. So there isn't really a singular collective reason, but we do know that it started around the early 1900s that states really started cracking down on it, primarily in an effort to prevent the spread of venereal diseases. Prostitution at the time being a particularly popular occupation because women had few lucrative opportunities to make their own money and be financially independent, especially during World War I, when many women were either widowed or waiting for their husbands to return from the war. And these laws, intended to prevent sex work and sex trafficking, still come about today. FOSTA and SESTA were bills passed in 2018 that essentially prohibited talking about sex work and sex in general in certain online spaces, and held the platforms liable. Now, you may not have heard of these bills before, but you probably did hear about Tumblr, the social media app, banning all illicit sexual content, or Craigslist removing their personal ads section, both of which happened as a direct result of the influence of SESTA and FOSTA. So, how have these worked out for the United States? Well, SESTA and FOSTA made it a lot more difficult for sex workers to communicate with each other, to do things like screen clients and share their experiences, and advertise their services online, things that keep them off the streets. And prostitution being illegal and unregulated means the workers who get sick with an STD in the United States are less likely to get tested, get treated, and the statistics regarding those are a lot harder to track. For example, according to the Department of Health and Human Services, the rates that sex workers contract STDs is anywhere from 5 to 60 times higher than in the general public. So definitely bad, but with a window that big, it's really hard to get an idea of how bad exactly. And criminalization hasn't really been a big deterrent. According to the NCJRS, about 1% of women have engaged in prostitution in the United States, which may not seem significant, but the United States is the third country with the most prostitutes per capita, behind China and India. So criminalization doesn't seem great, but what are the alternatives, and are they better? Well, partial legalization is an option where prostitution is allowed, but it's heavily regulated. Maybe you need a license, regular screening, health screenings, only operate in a brothel or certain settings. There are actually certain areas in Nevada where it is illegal to work in a brothel. And many countries like Norway and Sweden and Iceland have a system of partial legalization that's usually called the Nordic model, where it is not illegal to sell sex, but it is still illegal to buy sex and to profit from other sex workers, otherwise called pimping. Now, not all of these countries have exactly the same systems, but they all share the general purpose of ending demand. This has a lot of benefits. Sex workers have better access to healthcare, and according to a survey from Avert, the rates of HIV are much lower in these areas of partial regulation as opposed to the United States. They also invest a lot into exit services with the intent to get sex workers out of the industry. It's also much easier for these workers to come forward if the conditions they're working in are poor, or if they've experienced abuse or violence at the hands of a client or manager. But there are still issues with this model. For example, the workers can come forward with complaints if a client were to see a sex worker who seems underage or who looked like they'd been abused. They would not be able to report it without facing criminal charges. And a scenario that, according to APAC, the Adult Performer Advocacy Committee, it has happened on numerous occasions where people from countries that work under this Nordic model call and say, I've been in this brothel, something's not right, I can't go to the police, what do I do? Furthermore, it's a system that is added to the social stigma surrounding sex work and the legal power this has over sex workers. You may not be able to be arrested for prostitution, but you can be evicted from your home, fired from your job, and have your property seized for performing sex work. For example, if you are working, making money as a prostitute, totally legally, you cannot give that money to your landlord because that would be profiting off of sex work, which is also pimping, which is illegal. Norwegian law says you must be given 3 months to notice before you're evicted. But according to PION, a sex workers' rights group, hundreds of sex workers have been illegally evicted without notice, with no assistance from the police or the government. So it may seem better than criminalization, but the law still has a difficult time distinguishing between these third parties that are helping sex workers and third parties that are hurting sex workers. And that's because the real goal of the Nordic model is to end demand for sex work as opposed to provide these workers with aid. So criminalization sucks. Legalization is an improvement. But what's the difference between legalization and decriminalization? Well, the biggest difference is that it gives more power to sex workers independently. You'd have the much safer option of selling sex in a home with other workers without facing brothel charges. You could hire a bodyguard and pay rent without the fear of pimping. And services to get people out of the market can still exist, but people who prefer sex work can operate without any fear of repercussion and with the reassurance that the law would actually be on their side. The fact of the matter is some people prefer sex work, and it's a fitting job if you maybe have difficulty working long hours or you struggle with manual labor. And decriminalization would also allow more time and resources to be focused on the violations that occur under it. Labor rights violations, sex trafficking. Regardless of however you try and regulate or criminalize it, sex work is going to exist. We have Sumerian records listing prostitution as an occupation as early as 2400 BCE, and it's still around today. So I think it's safe to say that it's not going anywhere. It's going to stick around. And decriminalization is the best way to put the power into the hands of the workers, to keep them safe, and to give them control over their own lives. It's the most effective for promoting public health and combating human rights violations like human trafficking.